On this channel, I've been talking about telepathy, which is something I've been thinking and writing about for some years now, along with other types of psychic experiences. Obviously, we want to see if there's any evidence for it, otherwise it's just an idea. So how do we do that? How do we test for telepathy? I've described card guessing, which at one time was a favorite method, but there is another way which is just as simple and easy to do, which anyone can do in fact, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. Hello, I'm Robert, a journalist and former editor of the Psi Encyclopedia, which gives in-depth information about the scientific investigation of these things and the controversies around them. What I'm looking at today is telepathic drawings. That is, when one person tries to reproduce a drawing that another person has made, but without actually having seen it. So let's say you're doing it with a friend or partner or family member, testing to see whether they have any telepathic ability. You'd sit alone or where they can't see you with pencil and paper and draw something, pretty much anything at all really, an object, a shape, or even just an abstract pattern. Then you put it somewhere where it can't be seen, or even seal it up in an envelope if you want to be rigorous about it. When that's done, the other person, also sitting alone with pencil and paper, tries to mentally envisage what that drawing is, and then to reproduce it. So now you've got two drawings and you just need to compare them. Is there any resemblance? Do the drawings match at all? If you think there's no such thing as telepathy, then any resemblance must be a matter of chance, right? Sometimes things do match up in surprising ways. But the matches that some people have achieved in these sorts of experiments are so detailed and exact and achieved so often, it might seem to go far beyond that, just as if telepathy was operating, in fact. There are several cases of this, and the one I want to look at here is described in a book called Mental Radio, published in 1930, so nearly a century ago. The author was Upton Sinclair, a famous novelist and left-wing activist, and the book is about a long series of experiments he carried out together with his wife Craig. She'd experienced unusual dreams and intuitions since childhood, and in later life began experimenting with mental concentration and clairvoyance. She found, or at least believed she found, that she could sometimes pick up information from other people's minds. The drawing experiments grew out of that. Upton would make a drawing while Craig was out of the room, then seal it in an envelope or leave it face down out of sight. Then he'd leave the room. Craig would come in, lie on the sofa and relax to get her mind into a meditative state, and wait for an image to form in her mind. When she felt she had something, she'd sit up and draw it. Then they'd compare the results. In all, they did 290 of these tests. Upton judged 65 of them to be clear successes, with more or less exact matches. Another 155 he thought were partial hits, where Craig got some of the details right, and the remaining 70 were obvious failures, which is actually a pretty high success rate. Let's look at some examples. I think this is meant to be a helmet of the kind used by German army officers at the time with a spike on top. But whatever it is, you can see the resemblance achieved in Craig's version is quite striking. Pretty much an exact match. Here's Upton's drawing of a tree, and here's Craig's version. Hers isn't identical with his, obviously, but it has the same overall structure. And remember, she isn't looking over his shoulder. The original is sealed away or lying face down on a table. This one is just a geometric figure rather than a recognizable object, but Craig's version is again very close. A curious and consistent characteristic in these sorts of experiments, found not just by the Sinclairs but by others as well, is that the person who's trying to guess the object gets the shape right, but thinks it's something quite different from what the other person actually intended. In this one, Upton drew a puppy chasing something on a string. Craig reproduces it, but for some reason thinks it's an elephant, apparently seeing the string as its trunk. I don't know how she got that, don't see it myself, but the resemblance between the two drawings is obvious. Here, Upton draws what looks like a football, and Craig reproduces the shape pretty accurately, but again thinks it's something quite different. Now that may sound like a weakness in the evidence, but in a way it's also part of what makes these cases so interesting. The impression doesn't arrive with a neat label saying football or dog or tree. It comes in visual form, which you then have to try to make sense of. There's another complication. Sometimes Craig seems not to get the target drawing at all, but rather something else that Upton had been looking at or thinking about around the same time. For instance, in one case, Upton copied an image from a newspaper and Craig got something entirely different. But Upton did recognize what she'd drawn. It was from an advertisement on the opposite page of the paper, something he'd seen but hadn't intended to be the target. Also, if Upton prepared several drawings in one batch, Craig sometimes appeared to describe not the intended target, but one of the other drawings. One time she described seeing some sort of grinning monster, only the face, and a vague idea of deformed neck and shoulders. The face of the creature is broad and weird. She didn't try to draw it, and in fact what she said had nothing to do with the actual target, which was a leg with a roller skate, so a complete failure in strict terms. But it turned out to be a pretty exact description of what we're looking at here, which was one of the other drawings in the same batch. In another case, she drew what looks like a steamboat with smoke coming out of a funnel, and it didn't match what Upton had drawn, not even close. But the next target actually was a steamboat, so it seemed that she'd been picking up the right details in the wrong place. The oddity here is that the hits often seem to be displaced, shifted onto the wrong target, or mixed up with some other image in Upton's mind, and this is a widely reported feature in telepathy experiments. Then there are the more fragmentary cases where Craig seems to get only part of the image, but gets that part quite accurately. Here's Upton's version of a heart. Craig gets the top section very clearly and then dots in part of the surrounding contour. This one isn't exact by any means, but the head and the two lines do capture the basic structure. This began as Upton's attempt at a conch shell. Craig thought it might be a lifebuoy floating in water, which sounds quite different. But if you just compare the shapes and lines, there's an obvious resemblance. This one Craig recognized in some sense, but interpreted as a trumpet flower, something they had in their garden, and then added extra material of her own. And here you can see the curved handle of an umbrella echoed in something she actually thought was a snake. Sometimes Craig simply described what she saw in her head, without trying to draw it. For instance, this one she described as a muley cow with tongue hanging out, this one as a goat, and this one as a sailboat, which are all pretty much spot on, I think. In other cases, she seems to get the broad shape while missing the smaller details. Here she gets the basic windmill form, but not much more than that. Here again, she seems to have got the basic architectural pattern without reproducing it exactly. In this one, Upton drew 16 little crosses, or at least that's what they looked like to me. In fact, he meant them to represent stars. And apparently that's what they also meant to Craig, because she not only reproduced them, although 12 instead of Upton's 16, she also added a crescent moon, so obviously in some way associating the image with the night sky. The book attracted quite a lot of attention, not least because it had a short preface by none other than Albert Einstein, who said he'd read it with great interest and encouraged psychologists and others to take it seriously, though he stopped short of endorsing telepathy itself, later admitting he didn't believe in it because it didn't fit with known physics, which is fair enough. Critics, of course, were much less impressed. Wikipedia quotes Martin Gardner, who for decades was a prolific and scathing debunker of all things paranormal, one of the main go-to people for a conventional explanation. Gardner thought that Upton Sinclair was gullible, although to be fair, he said that about everyone who took things like this seriously. On my reading, Sinclair comes across as careful and conscientious. He seems aware of the pitfalls, takes care to avoid them, and is clearly treating it as a serious experiment. So I don't know how far you can go with that. Gardner goes on to say, one must not rule out the possibility that in many tests made across the width of a room, Mrs. Sinclair may have seen the wiggling of the top of a pencil or arm movements, which would convey to her unconscious a rough notion of the drawing. So in other words, getting clues from watching Upton do the target drawing, which is actually a rather clever idea and exactly the sort of thing that Gardner would come up with, as he knew a lot about the tricks used by conjurers and mentalists. But in fact, we must rule it out because Sinclair points out more than once that Craig wasn't present in the room when he was making the drawing. Gardner's other main idea actually does have some merit. Perhaps Craig simply had a feel for the sort of things Upton was likely to draw. Furniture, simple objects, familiar shapes. And actually that's testable. You can try it yourself. Ask someone to imagine they're doing this experiment with you and get them to write down 10 things they might draw for you to telepathically reproduce. Meanwhile, independently make your own list of things you think that person might draw. Then compare the lists. I tried it with a family member and we did get some overlap, 2 out of 10 items as it happened. So yes, there may be a certain amount of intuitive convergence around obvious objects. But we were looking at objects within our visual range, ordinary household stuff, and also they appeared on our lists in a different order, so they wouldn't have been matches. But Upton says in any case they made every effort to go beyond that, he using his imagination to come up with unusual things and looking at newspapers and magazines for ideas. As it happens, a researcher was able to test the chance coincidence explanation more directly. He first did an independent analysis of the couple's complete notes and drawings, finding that he largely agreed with Upton's judgment of successes, partial successes and failures. Still subjective, but it helps to have some independent confirmation. So now for what it's worth, I'll tell you what I think. Obviously this wasn't done in controlled conditions, so it can't be presented as formal evidence, let alone proof. That said, if the couple had taken it to the next level and agreed to be tested in a laboratory environment, I don't think it would have made it more believable. There have been equally convincing demonstrations done in laboratories that aren't taken any more seriously. In fact, Craig was formally tested, with an experimenter taking the place of her husband. But the results were less impressive, and that sort of makes sense. Something I've noticed a lot reading the literature of this sort of research is that telepathy seems to work best when there's a strong rapport between two individuals, working together conscientiously and creatively and in their own time, when they actually feel like doing it. Trying to do it to order in a laboratory environment with people fussing around you tends to inhibit that. Before I wrap up, there's just one point I want to leave you with, which is the importance of noting what's going on in our heads when we scrutinize this sort of thing. Look again at these pairs of images. What do we think we're looking at here? If you're like me, you may naturally suppose that in each pair, the one on the right is a straightforward copy of the one on the left, made while the person was actually physically looking at it. That's what we automatically think. Either that or that both images were made by people who were looking at the same object, like in an art class. For me, it takes an effort of will to see it in a different way, that in fact the drawing on the right is the representation of a mental image that's appearing in the mind of a person who is trying to see a drawing in a sealed envelope that she has no knowledge of and that just happens to match exactly. I don't know about you, but when I really focus on this, I find it literally incredible. And my point is, we don't have a category for this. It's utterly against our conditioning. We'd started practically the moment we were born and most likely never encountered anything like this in daily life, ever. That's at least partly why we find it so hard to deal with, why we try to fill the gap with ideas about gullible believers or conjuring tricks or natural coincidence. I also think it's a reason why this whole space is so deeply controversial, something I'll be exploring in later videos, and I hope I'll see you there.